protesters in Ferguson have been focusing on the police. The numbers tell a different story, which Juan Williams referred to earlier. Homicide is the #1 cause of death among black males between ages 15 and 34. And 91% of black murder victims are not killed by the police, but killed by other blacks. So, in a sense, are the protesters focusing on the wrong problem?
First of all, I wish Dr. Carson and I were a part of that white panel that you just had.
All right, folks, welcome back. That is insane. We played that soundbite for you on Monday, the day after Jesse Jackson said, I wish Dr. Carson and I were on that white panel you just had. That white panel included Juan Williams, who's not white. Joining us now, columnist and contributing editor for TheRoot.com, David Swerdlick, and contributing editor at the American Spectator and former aide to President Ronald Reagan, Jeffrey Lord. Gentlemen, Jeffrey, you've written a piece for the American Spectator, Jesse Jackson and the renewed fight to racialize America. And one of the first things you write is, if Juan Williams, a black man, were on Fox News Sunday panel with the white Bob Woodward, Laura Ingraham, and Karl Rove, all discussing events in Ferguson, would the panel still be an all-white panel? And I guess, according to Jesse Jackson, the answer is yes.
Well, the thing that I think has now really become evident is that we are on our way, if a lot of people or some people get their way, to re-racializing America, judging people by skin color. And that comment from Jesse Jackson was very revealing as to the way his mind works. He didn't hear 5 human beings or 5 Americans on that panel. What he was listening to was, quote unquote, an all-white panel, and poor Juan Williams is suddenly no longer black. Not unlike, as you and I had been discussing here, Harry Reid saying that 5 white men on the Supreme Court in terms of the Hobby Lobby decision, when of course Clarence Thomas is black. If you're gonna parse this and think this and sort of violate what President Kennedy used to say about race having no place in American life or law, then this is what happens.
David?
Well, look, clearly Jesse Jackson made a mistake referring to a panel with Juan Williams on it as an all-white panel. I'm sure he would acknowledge that mistake if he were here now. I don't disagree with Jeffrey on that point, but I do disagree with Jeffrey in the sense that I don't see some sort of conscious effort on the part of Reverend Jackson or on the part of politicians or on the part of whoever he's referring to. I did read Jeffrey's article to re-racialize America. We've talked about this on your show before, Steve, and I just find that this attempt to characterize liberals as trying to make everything about race is inaccurate, and I certainly don't think it fits this situation here in Ferguson, where there is a racial component, whether people want it to talk about it or not.
Well, Jeffrey, you point out in your piece, and David, I want you to address this. Jeffrey, talk about the 9/11 memorial with the firefighters and how they had out of political correctness, they represented a white firefighter, a black firefighter, a Hispanic firefighter, no Asians, as you pointed out, even though they were involved in it as well. So, I mean, doesn't that help make your point and basically dispute what David had to say?
Right. On the day of 9/11 itself, on the original 9/11, when everything had just gone chaotic, there was, of course, a photographer down there, photographers immediately, and this one photographer happened to stumble on 3 firemen who were raising an American flag on a flagpole that was leaning sideways, and it became sort of a classic of the day. Well, years later, they decided they wanted to make a statue of this, so they made a statue, but instead of the 3 white firemen, they put in, bean counting style, 1 black, 1 Latino, and 1 white, and the poor Asians were left out. And I said, I don't know how you tell, but no gays were represented and no women were represented. This is indicative of the mindset that we are headed to. And frankly, this all comes back from, these are the heirs who do this. These are the heirs of slavery and segregation. I mean, who supported slavery, who supported segregation, judging people by skin color, and then taking certain actions. That's really all this is today, and it's frankly, it's shameful.
David?
Yeah, look, we just see this fundamentally differently, and I did understand the point that Jeffrey was trying to make in his piece on the American Spectator, but this is what I would say in response to that. Number one, I don't see why you would tie that particular issue of this statue to what happened and what we all saw and what we all talked about in Ferguson. I think those two issues can be talked about separately. Number two, I'm not going to defend someone who's sort of doing a revisionist statue, if that's what it is. I frankly haven't seen it, of what happened right after 9/11. I'd be the first one to say, if they were trying to recreate an image of something that actually happened and all those firefighters were white, fine, do a statue of firefighters who are white and find another way to celebrate diversity. I don't have any disagreement with that point. There was an incident in my town where I live a few years ago, where not an incident, but a situation in my town a few years ago where the town council renamed one of the major thoroughfares Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And even though it's fine, I wasn't particularly in favor of that because I thought, why name a street that already has a name after Martin Luther King when you could name something like the town hall, which had no name, after Martin Luther King instead? But what I object to with conservatives is this idea that people of color, whether they're black, white, Latino, Asian American, on and on I could list, American Indian, gay, straight, people want to celebrate diversity, and people whose voices haven't been heard before or been represented in our culture before want more visual and vocal representation. And I don't think that means that people want to re-racialize everything. It's just a different way of looking at it.
Jeffrey?
Where I would disagree with you, David, is you use the word diversity, which is a favorite liberal word, and really it isn't diversity. If liberals really believed in what they say here, then they would have been supporting Clarence Thomas in his nomination for the Supreme Court. But they didn't because he was a black conservative. This happens time after time after time. I mean, I know many black conservatives, activists like Deneen Borelli, and they can tell you chapter and verse how they are rejected by the NAACP, that they are gone after in all kinds of ways, some of which are not mentionable on the air, simply because they're both black and conservative. In other words, this is not about diversity. This is about political correctness. And you can look any way you want, but if you believe the wrong thing, quote unquote, and you're diverse in your thought, then they're going to be excluding you. And that's the real root of the problem here. This is about liberalism. It's not about diversity.
And David, no pun intended on the root.com there, but go ahead, react.
No, Jeffrey, again, I think you've articulated that position well. I've heard that position from other conservatives, but again, I just simply disagree. Look, for one thing, I'm not going to relitigate Clarence Thomas 20-odd years later, but with someone like you brought up, Deneen Borelli, I've interviewed Deneen Borelli. I've spoken to her. I know her. I've read her books. I know her work. And I think that if anybody was to insult her or use a derogatory term about her or say that she was, I'm just going to use one term, a sellout because she's a black conservative, I don't support that. I am against that 100%. But what I have said to black conservatives, who I cover quite frequently, is that if you're African American and you hold a particular political viewpoint that is the sort of 180-degree viewpoint of 90% of African Americans, then you would expect that people would want you to explain where you're coming from. Not to insult them, but to explain, okay, you come from, at least to a certain degree, a background similar to us. How do you come in from this perspective? And I think that's a fair discussion to have without insults, without labeling people.
Jeffrey, go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'm not really sure. I mean, when I hear you say that, and you say that 90% of the black community, I was reading something from a former Bush aide named Ron Christie, who was an African American.
Frequent guest on this show, yeah.
I know Ron Christie as well.
And he said there is no such thing as a black America, and I agree with him. There's just America. There is just America, and the idea that 90% of one racial population has to think a certain way is wrong. Is wrong, and I don't care whether it's the black community or the Latino community or the Irish community.
Jeffrey, let David respond. Go ahead, David.
I'm not suggesting that anybody has to think a certain way or that there's anything wrong with an African American having conservative beliefs. All I'm talking about when I say 90%, I should have clarified and said how people vote. 90+% of black people vote Democrat. Whether they agree with Democrats on every issue is obviously a more nuanced discussion. But again, so I think people should not be pigeonholed or labeled or called names or told that they can't speak up and have the opinions they have. But I do think it's fair for African Americans, discussing issues among African Americans and with others to say, okay, look, if Black conservatives are holding views that are very different from the overwhelming majority of African Americans, it's something that causes people to wonder how they arrived at those views. Even if in some cases, maybe I might share those views. It's still worth discussing how they arrived at that.
All right,
point.
interesting. And David, I wonder how many African Americans, as you said, don't agree on all issues but vote Democrat anyway. If you're using the voting block as an example or as a focal point, I wonder how many really realize that they have a lot of conservative values, more similar to Republicans and conservatives than liberals and Democrats on many family issues, etc. Okay, guys, very interesting conversation. Thank you, David Swerdlick and Jeffrey Lord. Appreciate it. Up next, Give Me Five. Don't go away.